The night was quiet. Too quiet. The human sat in his small home on the edge of the village, the fire burning low. He had almost closed his eyes when a soft sound came from the door. It was not the wind, not the rustle of leaves, but a weak knock. Gentle and uncertain, he froze, his heart beating faster. Who would knock at this hour when most of the village slept? He rose slowly and walked to the door, his steps heavy. The knock came again, more desperate this time. He pulled the door open, and what he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. Standing outside was an alien woman, her clothes torn and her face pale. Two small children clung to her legs, their eyes wide and hollow with hunger. They looked so fragile, as if one strong wind could carry them away. The woman lowered her head and whispered, "Please, we have nowhere else to go." Her voice trembled as though she had rehearsed those words many times but never dared to speak them. The human looked past her, but there was no one else, only the cold night stretching into shadows. The children, pressed closer against their mother, their tiny hands gripping her skirt. One of them gave a small cry, weak and thin. It pierced the silence like a blade. The human felt a strange weight in his chest, a feeling he could not name. He had seen widows before, broken families, starving children, but this was different. Something in their eyes was asking not only for food or warmth, but for something deeper. He hesitated, his hand still on the door. Why had she come here to him, when there were others in the village? Why knock on the house of a human when her own people lived nearby? Before he could ask, she spoke again, her voice almost breaking. They need a father," she whispered, her words heavy with shame. The human felt his breath catch, his mind racing. What did she mean? What was she asking of him? The fire inside his house was almost dead, yet he stepped aside and let them in. The children rushed to the warmth, sitting by the ashes as if it was a treasure. The woman entered slowly, her body shaking, her eyes glancing around as though she feared rejection at any moment. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold, shutting out the dark world outside. The widow knelt beside her children, brushing their hair back with trembling fingers. Her face carried deep lines of sorrow, but in her eyes flickered a spark of hope. The human poured the last of his water into a cup and handed it to her. She accepted it with both hands, bowing her head in silence before letting her children drink first. The sight made his throat tighten. The night stretched long, the air heavy with unspoken words. The human sat near the fire, watching as the widow wrapped her children in a thin blanket. They fell asleep quickly, their breaths shallow, their small faces peaceful at last. The mother did not sleep. She kept her gaze fixed on the fire, her eyes filled with quiet pain. At last she looked at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but she said nothing, only lowered her head again. The human wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers. Why had she come? Why him? What was she truly offering? But something stopped him. Perhaps the sight of her children sleeping, perhaps the fear of the truth. Outside, the wind howled, carrying whispers of the village, whispers of judgment and cruelty. Inside, in that small house, a fragile moment of safety formed. The human sat in silence, but his mind was not silent. He felt the weight of their presence pressing into his life. The widow had brought more than herself and her children. She had brought a question that would not leave him, a question that would change everything. Could he, alone, human, become the father her children cried for? The fire burned low, shadows dancing across the walls, and the human realized that his quiet life had ended the moment he opened the door. The knock at midnight had not only brought a widow and her children, it had brought a choice, one that would test his heart, his strength, and his place in a world that was not his own. And though he did not yet know it, this night was only the beginning of a story that would bind them all together. The morning came slowly, gray light spilling through the cracks of the wooden walls. The human stirred from his chair near the fire, his back stiff and sore. He had not slept, not truly. His eyes had stayed half open, watching the fragile figures lying on the floor. The alien widow had finally dozed off, her children curled into her side like tiny birds seeking warmth. For a moment the human wondered if it had all been a strange dream. but the sound of a child's stomach growling quickly reminded him it was real. He rose and searched his small cupboard, finding only a few dry pieces of bread and a half jar of preserved roots. It was not much, not enough for him alone. But when he looked back at the children staring at him with wide, hollow eyes, his hands trembled. Their gaze held no greed, no demand, only the raw ache of hunger that had no words. He placed the food before them, and the children fell upon it as if it were a feast from the stars. They tore at the bread with shaking hands, crumbs falling across the floor, their little mouths chewing so fast it seemed they feared it might vanish. The widow sat beside them, her hands still, her eyes lowered. She did not touch the food, not even when he pushed a piece toward her. Instead, she let her children eat first, watching them with silent tears gathering in her eyes. The human frowned, sliding the piece closer. "You should eat," he said, softly, but she only shook her head, whispering, "Not until they are full." Her voice carried such sorrow, such strength, that the human felt something twist deep inside his chest. As the children ate, the human studied them more closely. Their cheeks were hollow, their ribs sharp beneath thin clothes. Their small hands bore scratches, their feet raw and bruised. They had lived hard days, perhaps many weeks of suffering. The youngest finished first and crawled into his lap without a word, curling against him as if it was the most natural thing. The human froze, not knowing what to do, but the child closed her eyes, comforted by his warmth. The widow lifted her gaze then, and he caught it. Those alien eyes filled with both shame and gratitude. The silence grew heavy, and at last he asked, "Why me? Why did you bring them here?" The widow's lips trembled before she spoke, her voice low. "They cried for a father," she said, her hands clutching the blanket around. "Her children, I cannot give them one, but maybe you." Her words faltered, her throat tightening as if the sentence was too painful to finish. The human felt the air thicken, his heart thudding harder. He wanted to protest, to say he was no father, no savior, just a man alone in a hostile village. But the small weight of the child in his lap told another story. Outside, voices began to stir, neighbors waking to the day. The human imagined what they would say if they saw this. A human man with an alien widow in his home, her children eating his food. The village had long tongues and cruel eyes, and already he felt their whispers crawling against his back. The widow seemed to sense it too, her body tensing, her ears flicking at every sound outside. She leaned closer and whispered, "They will hate you for helping us." The human stared at her, stunned by her blunt words. "And you knew this?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She nodded slowly, her gaze falling back to her children. "But they were hungry, and I had no one else." The human swallowed hard, staring at the thin smoke curling from the fire. Her honesty cut deeper than anger ever could. She had placed her pride, her safety, even his safety, all beneath the needs of her children. And somehow, in that moment, he understood the weight she carried. The widow's hands shook as she pulled her children closer, her voice cracking as she whispered, "They cry at night, calling for a father who is gone. I cannot answer them, no matter how hard I try." The words tore through the silence, leaving the human without breath. He looked again at the children, their tired faces calmer now, their bellies no longer empty. The older one peeked at him, a crumb stuck to her lips, her eyes bright with a spark of trust. It was so small, so fragile, yet it pierced him more sharply than any blade. In that gaze, he felt both hope and demand, as if she was silently asking, "Will you be the one?" He could not answer, not yet, but he knew one truth. He had opened his door last night, and now the weight of their lives had entered with them. The hungry eyes of those children would not let him walk away easily. As the sun rose higher, spilling light through the cracks, the human realized that the quiet life he had clung to was slipping from his hands. He had stepped into something larger, heavier, and far more dangerous. And as the widow whispered a soft thank you, her voice breaking with emotion, he understood this was only the beginning. The village would whisper, the world would judge, but inside his home 3 fragile lives now looked to him, and their hungry eyes had already bound him to a choice he could not escape. The morning sun rose higher, warming the dusty paths of the alien village. The human stepped outside with the widow and her children, their heads bowed low. He thought maybe fresh air would ease the weight inside the small house. But instead, he felt another weight pressing down. Eyes sharp and unkind turned toward them the moment they walked through the street. Whispers began at once, voices low but cutting like knives. "There goes the widow," one alien muttered, her tone dripping with disgust. "She clings to a human now, desperate," another replied. Laughter followed, cruel and cold. The human clenched his fists, forcing himself not to react. The children hid behind his legs, clutching his clothes, as if afraid the voices themselves could harm them. The widow's face stayed calm, but he saw the pain flicker in her eyes. She had walked this road many times, and every step had been heavy with shame. They reached the market square, where stalls overflowed with fruit, grain, and dried meats. The smell of food filled the air, and the children's stomachs growled. Once more the human's heart twisted. He had no coin left after sharing what little he had. He scanned the stalls, hoping someone might show mercy. But as soon as vendors noticed the widow, their smiles turned to scowls. One slammed his basket shut, another waved them away like flies. "No trade for beggars," one spat, his eyes fixed on her. "And no trade for humans who protect them." The words cut deep, but the human stood, firm. He took the widow's hand gently and led her away from the hostile crowd. Behind them the whispers grew louder, filled with venom. "Shameful, cursed, she brings ruin." The children's eyes filled with tears, but they made no sound, only buried their faces in his coat. The human's blood boiled, yet he held his anger inside. For now the safest path was silence. Later, when they returned to his home, the widow sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She did not cry, though her children pressed against her side, seeking comfort. The human finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with anger. "Why do they treat you this way?" The widow looked at him, her eyes tired, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I am alone," she said softly. "Because my husband died. Because I carry no man's protection. They see me as less than nothing." She lowered her gaze, whispering, "And now they will punish you too for standing with me." The human leaned back, his fists clenched on his knees. He had thought cruelty belonged only to warlords and raiders. But here it lived in ordinary faces, in neighbors who claimed to know honor. The widow's words echoed in his chest, stirring something fierce inside him. But before he could speak, the youngest child climbed onto his lap again, resting her head against him. Her eyes met his, wide and searching, and he felt the question. Once more, "Will you protect us?" That night the house was quiet again, but not peaceful. The human heard voices outside, faint but unmistakable. Villagers stood in the shadows, whispering close to his walls. Their words slithered through the cracks, filled with hate. "He takes her in," one hissed. "He thinks he can play father. Let him, it will bring him ruin," another sneered. The human's chest tightened, his anger rising like fire. He almost opened the door, but the widow laid a trembling hand on his arm. "Do not," she whispered, her voice shaking. "If you fight them now, they will return with worse." He looked at her, torn between rage and reason. Her eyes begged him to stay still, to protect her children with patience, not violence. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, to sit and endure the venom of cowards outside his door. The whispers faded after a while, leaving silence heavier than before. The widow exhaled slowly, tears glistening in her eyes, though none fell. The children had not stirred. They were too used to sleeping through fear. The human watched them, his heart aching with something he could not yet name. He lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling. The whispers of the village still crawled in his ears. But stronger than the whispers was the memory of the children's hungry eyes and the widow's trembling voice. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. The village had turned its back, and soon it would do worse. But deep inside, a decision was beginning to grow. A quiet fire that told him he could not let them walk alone in this cruel world. He had opened his door once, and now he felt that door would never close again. The night stretched on, filled with shadows and silent promises. And though the human did not speak them aloud, the children's trust and the widow's broken courage had already written his path. The whispers of the village would soon become more than words, but when that day came, he would have to decide who he truly was, an outsider with no ties or the father these children cried for. The night after the whispers, the human sat near the fire again. The widow worked silently, mending the torn edges of her children's clothes with clumsy stitches. Her hands shook as she sewed, the dim light making her face look tired and older than she was. The children slept close together, their little breaths soft and even. The human watched them, but his thoughts were heavy. The village had turned its back and danger pressed closer every day. At last he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You must tell me everything." The widow froze, the needle slipping from her fingers. She did not look at him, but her shoulders trembled. "What do you wish to know?" she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Why they hate you," the human said. "Why they spit at your name, why they call you cursed." The silence grew long, filled only by the faint crackle of fire. The widow closed her eyes, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I have hidden it too long," she whispered, "but perhaps you deserve the truth." She lifted her gaze, her alien eyes glistening in the firelight. "My husband died during the last raid," she said, her voice unsteady. "He stood against the raiders when no one else did. He bought us time to run, and for that, he was slain." Her lips quivered as she spoke, but she forced herself to continue. "And when I returned to the village, I thought they would help me. I thought they would care for the children of a warrior who gave his life." Her voice hardened, bitter and raw. "But instead, they turned their backs. They called me unlucky, cursed, a shadow that brings death." The human leaned closer, his fists tightening. "They cast you aside because your husband died?" he asked, his voice sharp. The widow nodded, her tears falling faster now. "They believe a widow carries bad fate. They say a man who ties himself to me will meet the same end, so they shun me. They laugh at me. They let my children starve." Her hands clutched the blanket around her, as if holding her family together with fragile strength. The human's chest burned with anger, but also with pity so strong it nearly crushed him. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "I offered you my bed not out of desire, but out of desperation." Her eyes met his, filled with both shame and honesty. "My children need a protector, someone the village will fear, someone they will not dare to harm. Without that, they will not survive." Her words fell heavy into the silence, and the human felt the weight of them settle into his bones. She was not asking for love, not even kindness. She was offering herself as a shield, hoping he might stand between her children and the cruelty of the world. The human leaned back, his mind racing. He had never imagined such a burden, never thought his quiet life would lead to this moment. Her children slept peacefully, unaware of the truth their mother had just spoken. But he could not unhear it, could not unsee the desperation in her eyes. He felt torn. Part of him wanted to walk away, to escape the scorn of the village. But another part, stronger now, told him he could not abandon them. The widow looked down, her voice trembling. "If this is too much, if you wish us gone, say so. We will leave by dawn." The words stabbed into his heart. He imagined them out in the cold, the children crying, the widow carrying her shame through the dark alone. The thought sickened him. He shook his head slowly, his voice rough. "No, you will not leave." The widow's lips parted, surprise flickering in her tired face. "But why?" she whispered. "Why risk yourself for us?" The human had no answer he could put into words. He only looked at the children, small and fragile, and felt the silent bond forming. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was something deeper, but he could not let them go. The widow stared at him for a long time, then bowed her head, silent tears running down her cheeks. In that moment, a fragile trust grew between them, built on truth, sorrow, and survival. Outside, the wind rattled the walls, carrying the voices of the village in the distance. The human knew those voices would not stay whispers for long. The secret was out now, not to the world, but to him, and it tied their fates together. He lay awake, late into the night, her words echoing in his mind. Her children need a protector. Her children need a father. The fire dimmed, the house grew quiet, but inside his chest burned a resolve he had not felt before. The widow's secret was now his burden, and whether he was ready or not, he had already stepped into their lives, and perhaps, he thought, into their hearts as well. The night was heavy, the kind of night where silence carried hidden dangers. The human sat near the fire, his thoughts restless after hearing the widow's secret. Her words repeated in his mind. Her children need a protector. Her children need a father. The children slept peacefully, curled close together under the blanket, their small breaths soft against the stillness. The widow dozed nearby, exhaustion finally pulling her into uneasy sleep. But the human could not rest. Something gnawed at him, a warning deep in his bones. Then he heard it. A sound outside, faint but sharp, the crunch of footsteps on the dirt. His body tensed, every muscle alert. The fire flickered low, shadows dancing across the walls. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped just beyond the thin, wooden door. Voices whispered in the dark, too low for the children to hear, but not too low for him. "You see? He shelters her," one hissed. "The cursed widow and her spawn." Another voice sneered. "Let him. It will bring him down. No human will stand against us." A third voice growled. "Not tonight. We will teach him what it means to protect filth." The human's blood boiled, his fists curling tight. He stood ready to throw the door open and face them, but a soft hand touched his arm. The widow was awake, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Don't. Please. They will hurt you, and if you fall, my children will have no one." Her words cut through his anger like cold water. He looked at her, torn between the urge to fight and the need to protect. The children stirred in their sleep as if they sensed the danger in the air. The widow clutched them close, her body trembling. Her eyes pleaded with him, shining in the dim light. "Stay. Protect. Don't let them win." The whispers outside turned to threats, louder now, their voices filled with cruelty. "She is cursed," one spat. "Drive her out. Let the night take her." "Burn the human's house if he won't listen," another hissed. The human's rage rose. His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. But he remembered the widow's words, remembered the fragile trust she had given him. If he ran outside now, fists swinging, they would return with more, stronger, crueler. He had to be patient. He had to be wise. The hardest fight was not always fought with weapons. Sometimes it was fought by holding back. Hours passed, and finally the voices faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence sharp and bitter. The human sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the door, his body rigid. The widow still held her children, though her tears fell silently onto their hair. He wanted to speak, to promise her safety, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he reached for the axe resting by the wall. Pulling it close, the widow's eyes followed his movement, fear and gratitude mixing in her gaze. He said nothing, but she understood. He would not let them harm her family. The next morning, the tension had not lifted. The village looked the same. The market bustled as before, but he felt the change in every glance thrown his way. The stares were sharper now, the whispers louder. The children clung to his hands as he walked with them, their eyes darting at every sound. The widow walked close, her head bowed, as though bracing for stones that might fly at any moment. The human kept his axe strapped to his back, not hidden, not ashamed. And when villagers noticed it, they looked away quickly, fear flashing in their eyes, but fear alone would not save them. He knew this. Last night had only been a warning, a taste of what was coming. Soon the threats would turn into real fire, real blood. As he watched the children nibble on the meager food he had managed to buy, he felt the weight of choice again. He could still walk away, leave them to fate, close his door and pretend their cries had never reached him. But every time the children's small eyes looked up at him, every time the widow's trembling voice whispered, "Thank you," the choice grew smaller. The human was no longer just a bystander. He was part of their fight now. That night he sharpened his axe slowly, the sound of the blade scraping filling the room. The widow watched in silence, her hands gripping her blanket. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "They will not stop." He paused, looking at her. "I know," he said simply. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She did not beg him to stay, she did not tell him to go. She only looked at him with quiet hope, a hope she barely dared to feel. And for the first time, he allowed himself to meet her gaze fully. He saw not just fear there, but trust, fragile and trembling, trust that he would not run, trust that he would stand. As the children slept again, the night stretched long. But this time the human did not sit in fear of the footsteps outside. This time he sat ready, his axe gleaming in the firelight, his resolve hardening. The threat in the dark had shown him the truth. He was no longer just sheltering strangers. He was defending a family, whether the village liked it or not. The night after the threats, the human did not sleep. He sat by the fire with his axe in hand, his eyes fixed on the door. The widow lay close to her children, her body curled protectively around them. The house was quiet, but the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, waiting. Every sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the scrape of branches, made his heart pound. But when dawn finally broke, the danger did not vanish, it only changed its face. The village stirred early and whispers followed him as he stepped outside. Some stared with open hatred, others with fear. He felt the weight of every eye, but he walked tall, the axe across his back like a warning. The children clung to his hands. The widow walked behind him, her head low. The stares burned into his skin, but he refused to bow. He was no longer hiding, no longer pretending this fight was not his. That evening, the storm finally came. It began with a shout outside, harsh and sharp. "Human," a voice roared. "Come out, leave the widow and her cursed brats or suffer with them." The children awoke with cries, clinging to their mother. The widow's face went pale, fear flooding her eyes. The human stood slowly, his grip tightening on the axe handle. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, making his features sharp and unyielding. He turned to the widow, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, they are many." He met her gaze, steady and firm. "Then let them come." The door shook under the force of a kick. The wood creaked, but it held. The human stepped forward, pulled it open himself, and faced the crowd outside. Torches lit, the night casting cruel light on the faces of half a dozen men. Their eyes glowed with hate, their voices spitting venom. "Leave her," one snarled. "She is cursed. She brings death. She will destroy you too." The human raised his axe, his voice calm but hard as stone. "She has done nothing but suffer. You will not touch her. You will not touch her children." The crowd laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Some shifted on their feet, uneasy under his steady gaze, but the leader stepped forward, his grin cruel. "A human playing father, how pathetic. You think you can protect them against all of us." The human tightened his grip. "Try me," he said, his voice low. The air grew tense, the night thick with danger. Then the leader lunged, raising a club. The human moved fast, his axe flashing in the firelight. He swung not to kill but to break. The club snapped in two under his strike. The attacker fell back with a cry. The others froze, fear flashing in their eyes. The human's stance was strong, his voice fierce as he growled, "If you want her, if you want the children, you will have to kill me first." The words cut through the night, heavy and final. For a long moment, no one moved. The villagers shifted, muttering, their courage fading in the shadow of his defiance. One by one, the torches lowered, the crowd breaking apart. The leader cursed, clutching his arm, but he too stepped back, his glare promising revenge. Finally, they vanished into the dark, their whispers carried away by the wind. The human lowered his axe slowly, his breath heavy. Inside the house, the widow stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and something deeper. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You stood for us." The human met her gaze, his chest rising and falling. "I told you, they will not touch you while I draw breath." Her lips parted, but no words came. Tears slid down her cheeks silently. The children rushed to him then, their small arms wrapping around his legs, their voices crying, "Father, Father." The word struck him like a thunderclap. He froze, his heart pounding, but he did not push them away. Instead, he bent down, pulling them close, holding them as tightly as they held him. The widow's sobs filled the room, not of despair this time, but of something fragile and new. She covered her face with her hands, whispering, "Thank you." Over and over the human looked at her, his arms still around the children, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel it. He was no longer just a stranger sheltering them. He was their shield, their strength, their father in all but name. The stand he made that night was not only against the village, it was against fate itself he had chosen, and that choice bound him to them forever. Outside, the night was quiet again, but it was not the same silence. It was the silence after a storm, the kind that warned another would come. But the human no longer feared it. The widow's eyes shone with trust. The children's voices called him father, and in his heart, a fire burned brighter than the hate of any village. The stand of a father had begun, and nothing could turn him back now. The morning after the fight, the human stepped outside to a silent village. No torches burned, no crowd gathered, but every door stayed shut. Every eye peered from cracks in the walls. The air felt heavy, thick with fear and shame. The villagers had seen his stand. They had heard his words, and now they whispered in secret, too afraid to face him. The human walked through the square with the widow and her children at his side. For the first time, no one shouted, no one spat, but their silence was sharper than any blade. The widow kept her head bowed, her steps small. Her children clung to him tightly, refusing to let go of his hands. He felt their tiny fingers grip his own as if holding on to life itself. And as he looked at them, something inside him shifted. He realized he was no longer carrying strangers through danger. He was walking with a family. His family, though. The world had not given them the name. That night, the widow lit a small lamp in the corner of the room. The children lay curled in their blankets, breathing softly. The house felt warmer than before, not because of the fire, but because of the bond growing inside it. The widow sat near him, her hands folded, her voice soft as she whispered, "I thought I had lost everything, my husband, my place, my dignity, but you gave me something back." The human turned to her, surprised by the steadiness in her tone. She lifted her gaze, her alien eyes shining. "You gave them a father, and you gave me a reason to hope again." Her words struck deep, breaking through the wall he had built. Around his heart, for a long moment, he said nothing, only looked at her. Her face was worn from sorrow, yet in that moment she looked strong, unbroken, alive. Finally he spoke, his voice low but certain. "You and your children are not alone anymore, not while I live." The widow's lips trembled. Her tears fell freely, but she smiled through them. A fragile smile, but real, more powerful than any words. Days turned to weeks, and though the village still whispered, their cruelty softened. Some avoided him, some glared, but none dared to touch them again. The human worked harder, trading his labor for food, bringing back more than enough for the widow and her children. The children began to laugh again, small voices filling the house with warmth. They followed him wherever he went, clinging to his arms, running to meet him when he returned. They no longer called him human or stranger. They called him father, their voices full of joy. And every time he heard it, his chest tightened. With a mix of fear and pride, the widow watched them with quiet eyes, her heart softening day by day. One evening, as the stars filled the sky, she whispered to him, "They chose you, without me saying a word. They chose you as their father." The human nodded, his voice steady, "And I chose them." Her breath caught, her hands covering her mouth as more tears fell, but this time they were tears of release, of healing. For so long she had carried shame and fear, but now she carried something else: trust, love, belonging. The villagers still muttered of curses, still spoke in shadows, but when they looked upon the widow's home, they saw a fire that could not be broken. They saw children who smiled, a woman who stood tall again, and a human who refused to bow. Whispers lost their power in the face of something stronger, and slowly, very slowly, the hate began to fade, replaced by silence and silence by uneasy respect. One night, the youngest child climbed into his lap, resting her head against his chest. She whispered softly, almost too quiet to hear, "Father, will you stay forever?" The human froze, his throat tight, then wrapped his arms around her. "Yes," he whispered back, "forever." The widow watched from across the room, her eyes glistening, her lips trembling as she whispered, "We are not cursed anymore, we are a family." The fire burned bright that night, its glow casting long shadows on the walls. But inside the house there was no fear, no shame, only warmth. The human sat with the children in his arms, the widow by his side. He realized then that his quiet life had ended the night of that knock at midnight. But what he had gained was far greater. He had not just taken in a widow and her children. He had found his place in a family that had chosen him. And in their eyes, he saw not sorrow, not hunger, but hope. Hope that would carry them all into a new tomorrow.